I could say pretty much without a doubt that if you're learning something that you don't enjoy, you're not going to be able to stick with it.
So are you saying that tefilmi is a little bit, dare I say, overrated?
Yes. Lawyer was crying to me that he mamish liegt stark in learning, but he had to go out for parnasa. He got a job at a major New York law firm, and he was working 70-hour weeks. And he said he's lucky if he could learn for 20 minutes a day, and he used to learn 15 hours a day. I said, why don't you move to like a town like Memphis? He says, what kind of chinuch are my kids going to have over there? I said, so you mean you're living in the New York area and you have to earn this much money because it's so important to you where your kids learn. Doesn't that mean that all of what you're doing all day is really a hechsher mitzvah? It's one of the most challenging projects I've ever done. One reason is, how do you teach Torah to somebody who doesn't believe in God? And it's really hard. And I said, you know what? Hard never scared me.
Shalom Aleichem, and welcome to Start Tank. Start Tank is a podcast about the challenges and opportunities of being a Bnei Torah in the workforce. As we are here in Elul preparing for the Yom Noraim, we are talking about the definition of success, and it is a great honor and privilege to have Rav Dovid Lichtenstein here to join us for today's conversation. So welcome, Rav Dovid.
Nice to be here. It's an honor.
So we're going to hit on a few main topics that we're going to try to define success in those areas. We're going to talk about talmid Torah. We're going to talk about work and careers. We're going to talk about technology. So let's start with talmid Torah. And I think by way of introduction, it would be great if you could start by giving us the origin story behind the Halacha Headlines podcast and how that came to be.
So in the shul of my neighborhood, they asked me to speak on Shabbos. So I was learning. I actually printed on Shabbos. So I said a really fabulous chabur on the sugya of Boyer. The Halachas Rashi and Ramban and Taisvis was really great, going back to the Paiskin, the Pri Megadim. And I started, there were around, 10, 15 people there. And like 20 minutes in, 5 of them were sleeping. And then by the time I finished, I think half was sleeping. I said, I guess they didn't like the machabura. So the next week I spoke about a different sugya in Shabbos. I spoke about baina and electricity, and here I lost another half. So by the end of the week, there were 3 guys up, and it was before Purim, and there was an article in the paper that Israel, the Palestinians alleged were using beautiful Shin Bet operatives to have illicit affairs with Arab leaders and to get information, which either is or isn't true. But I said, it's a very interesting topic. Halacha, would it be mutter? Wouldn't it be mutter? And it happened to be around Purim when you have Esther, Esther Karka Olam. I mean, this is the story of Esther. So I said a chabur on the topic: is it mutter to be quote unquote a honey trap? And this time, 25 people showed up, and all 25 people stayed awake. And I said, is it possible that they're more interested in the new news topics than they are just in, Yavamis Ksubas, Gittin, Kedushin, whatever Masechtas I may be learning? So I started saying on news topics, which was interesting because for the most part, these topics are never discussed in yeshiva. And most of the guys are ex-yeshivalite, and they found it fascinating. And it continued till this day. Like last week I spoke Chabur about, Eruvin, and is the Eruv in Muncie good? What's the problem with the Eruv in Borough Park? What was the Machlekes HaPoskim, etc. And people just really are into it when it's relevant. Like a lot of people say, we go home to Borough Park, we don't know whether we can use the Eruv or not, or at the Flatbush. So it was about speaking about topics that were really relevant in their lives. Before that, I spoke about what happens when one of a couple become less religious or irreligious. How do you deal with that from a halacha point of view? And you should have said it. Oh, I know somebody. And it's fascinating, Shaila, not discussed anywhere. So I would say that right now I'm probably on the 4th headline book, which means it's well over 100 topics, and for the most part, none of them are discussed anywhere, and all of them are very relevant. So that was the baseline. And in headlines itself, I've covered probably 300 or 400 topics, and for the most part, not discussed in yeshiva. Many are discussed in Paiskim, many are not discussed in the Paiskim, many are too new for the Paiskim. It became for me a lot of, it was, it created for me a real amelis b'Torah, and for my listeners, and many of them are rabbanim, and they'll use this stuff and they'll say shiurim, and you constantly get emails or calls. Can you send us which is why we started posting the Maramachaimis online.
So on that topic of the halacha headlines, there's books and there's podcasts. What are the takeaways for someone who's trying to build their own, say their halimud? What are the lessons that you take or would advise others who want to feel fulfillment in their learning based off of your experience building up headlines?
So I could say pretty much without a doubt that if you're learning something that you don't enjoy, you're not going to be able to stick with it. It's one thing when you're in yeshiva and you have no choice, but when you're coming home from work and you're probably pretty tired, it's a war out there. If it's something that doesn't grip you, you're not going to stick with it. And the challenge is finding something that interests you. And there's always something in learning that would interest you. You just have to find a part of Torah that talks to you. I remember years ago, Ramesh Shapiro was telling me a beautiful vart. He said, "We're mispal every day v'sein chalkeinu b'sayrasecha." He says, "What's chalkeinu? Like, what's my chelik different than your chelik? And what's the purpose? What does it mean?" And he said, "Imagine if you're telling a joke in front of a crowd, and you say the joke, and everybody laughs. It's a very funny joke. And then you say the joke again 10 minutes later. Maybe one person laughs. The third time you say it, people think you're struggling with some type of a dementia." So he said, imagine if you say a joke and then you go to a different masiba and you say the joke again, everybody will laugh, and you'll laugh too. Not fake, you really laugh. And then you go to a third place and you say over a third Hanukkah party and you say the joke and everybody laughs and you'll laugh. He says, why could you continue laughing when it's the third time you heard it? You would never laugh if you heard it from somebody else. So Ramesha wanted to say, he said, you're not really laughing at the joke so much. You're laughing at the fact that you are the one giving it over, and that gives it a special chiyas. So he says, "V'sein chalkeinu b'sarasecha" means everybody has to find the part of Torah that's as fresh to them as the person saying over the joke. The part that you always feel, I'm the one who's really connecting to this, and it really talks to me. And that's when you have v'sein chalkeinu b'sarasecha. And I could say that if you want to learn post-working and be able to live in it, it has to be something that you really enjoy.
So that's very interesting because even in just a few minutes that we've started this conversation, you've already contrasted the limud and the focus post yeshiva to the learning in yeshiva. And I feel like a lot of people, they're basically trying to learn the same way they did in yeshiva. After yeshiva, they're sort of trying to copy paste. They're trying to somehow take the same thing. Is that something that you also see is underappreciated? The fact that there can be a new focus and that's okay and it's legitimate?
For me, I learned in the Mir and a number of other, the name yeshivas, and we always learned things that were never relevant in any way. I mean, when was the last time you saw Yavama, right? I learned Yavamis 2 or 3 times in yeshiva, right? I mean, Ksubis a little bit more relevant if you're running an Ishus Bezdin, but a lot of Ksubis is not going to be relevant. And then again, even when you go to Nezikim, Baba Kama, Baba Matzia, Baba Basra, most of these sugyas are, we don't do knossos anymore. So you have to find. So it's imagine coming home and it's 8 o'clock at night or 9 o'clock at night. You open up and you have to learn Chalitza Psula. I just don't see it happening. I think in yeshiva you say, look, I'm really into that. Now, it could be you're very a person and the philosophical really speaks to you even then. But at some point for me, it became very much about learning things that were relevant, which is why even though I learned a lot of halacha when I was in Eretz Yisrael, but I totally changed afterwards to where, it became really most of my learning became halacha based. Halichas I love.
Right. So I started Daf Yomi when I started to work to have some sort of kavias and lima that would be sort of set and with a broader tzibor. But according to what you're saying, right, we're now doing horios, and I certainly identify with the challenge, and it's really, really a slog. So are you saying that Daf Yomi is a little bit, dare I say, overrated?
Yes. I would say it depends what you learn. I mean, Horius is fantastic. I mean, the whole beginning, is very relevant. Bezdin Shetah. I mean, you learn Horius, let's say, and you juxtapose that with the concept of Das Torah, right? And Das Torah is infallible, right? And you learn Horius, which is about the Bezdin Hagadol Shetah, and how everybody who listened to the Bezdin Hagadol has to bring a carbon. You say, wow, that's not what I was taught in yeshiva. So I think Horius is fabulous. I mean, also Horius is very relevant. Let's say this happens. That was just a few years ago was it I forgot which hechsher it was giving the hechsher on the Manalapan Chinese restaurant, and it was found out to be treif after years. So did all the people who ate that thing, were they considered chaitim? Would they have to bring a carbon? Would they have to bring a chatas? Right? And according to Hyrius, depending on how you learn it, but the answer would be yes. Or a mikveh that was wrong. I mean, so Hyrius happens to be one of the Masechtas that is somewhat relevant. But I mean, after Hyrius, I think comes Zvachim. If you could learn Zvachim and Daf Yomi and learn it, I say go for it. But for me, it would have been very hard.
Right. And then along the same lines that we're talking about, the transition from yeshiva Talmud Torah to Talmud Torah post yeshiva, the hashkafa around Talmud Torah is played up in yeshiva, which makes sense when you're learning all day and your Rebbe has been learning all day for his entire life, and everyone in the room is along the similar mindset. What's the correct hashkafa around Talmud Torah when you're not in learning all day? It's obviously central, that's undoubted, but that has to be balanced, I think, because if it's only a small slice quantity-wise of your day, how much really can it be the central avoda and the central pillar of everything we are all about when you're an actual balabas?
So I think that there's a number of points here, but remember a number of years ago, a lawyer was crying to me that he mamish liegt stark in learning. He was a very bright guy, but he had to go out for parnasa. He just didn't have a choice as far as he didn't want to live on tzedakah, whatever. And he went out to work, and suddenly he was working. He got a job at a major New York law firm, and he was working. The big law firms, they really chew you up and spit you out. I mean, he was doing 70-hour weeks. And he said he's lucky if he could learn for 20 minutes a day, and he used to learn 15 hours or 13 hours or 12 hours a day. And he was really upset. I said to him, why do you have to work at this law firm? He said, look, I have Kanai Nahara, 7 kids, and my tuition alone is 140 grand and this and that. So I said, why don't you move to like a town like Memphis, where a house over there is $150,000. The tuition is much less, and live over there. Why do you have to live in Lakewood or Flatbush, wherever it be? And he says, if I move to Memphis, what kind of chinuch are my kids going to have over there? And for me, what kind of chevra to learn or to daven, I'm not going to have. I have to. I said, so you mean you're living in the New York area, and you have to earn this much money because it's so important to you where your kids learn and where you daven and where your daughters go to school, right? So I said, so doesn't that mean that all of what you're doing all day is really a hechsher mitzvah? I mean, according to Shulchan Aruch, it actually is a mitzvah. So like in Reish Mem Hey, it talks about if you're Neiseya, but because of Shabbos, you're allowed to go, etc. Because it's our mitzvah. But it's at the very least, it's a hechsher mitzvah. Shulchan Aruch considers it a mitzvah, but in your case, it's certainly a mitzvah, right? So I said, so it's not about you're learning 15 minutes a day. I said, you're really learning. Your whole day is spent preparing to learn. I said, and that's to me, that's the Gemara says in Shabbos and Daf Kuf Yates or Kuf Chaf around there. The Gemara says lecharva Yerushalayim ad shebatla mimena anshe amana. Right, people of honesty, of integrity. The Gemara says, but the Gemara says, but there were in Yerushalayim talmidei chachamim, and the Gemara brings another pasuk. So the Gemara says, yeah, but it's talking about b'shari Yerushalayim. So shari Yerushalayim means business people. And Yerushalayim was charva when honest business people left. I mean, so the question is why business people and not regular people? And I think that the difference is that Torah is really instructions of how to live, right? And there are people that live their whole life just learning the instructions. But the person who says, I'm going to go out into the world where the tire meets the road and use the instructions to live a life in a way that's, don't we say, Lilmoy, the Lalame, Lishmer, Lases, Ulakayim? So isn't the Lakayim a part of Talmud Torah? Which means that the years in the yeshiva, it's Lilmoy, the Lalamed. But when we go out, there's a different chelik of Torah. It's called Lishmer, Lases, Ulakayim. So you're being Mekayim, the second half of Talmud Torah. So does it say any place that the second half of Talmud Torah is less than the first half of Talmud Torah? I mean, the pasuk says, "Pachad Yitzchak Hayeli Kiatarekim Shalachtani." Es onyi, he tells Lavan, "Es onyi, my labor, upachad Yitzchak Hayeli. I had great schus avos, and that's why I vanquished you, love. Yigia kapai g'doyle yigias kapayim a schus avos." Because he started off, if I had only, but then he finishes with, but Yigia kapai ro'alekem v'yechachamesh. And the Yagia Kapai that is greater than Chesavos is talking about the person who could use the Yagia Kapai as the Lishmer Lases Ulakayim. And that chelik of Torah is what Yaakov Avinu is mishtabach with. He's mishabeach with that part. Lekei avi upachad Yitzchak hayali ki ata rekam. You would have sent me back with nothing. But even on top of that, the Medrash says Yigia kapai relikim g'doyla. And what is that? It's not work. It's work as the showman that everything that I learned is really relevant and it's real and it can exist in the world. To a certain extent, people who feel that how can I go work? I'm going to have to meet women. It's true. You're going to meet women if you go work, right? Wherever you work. But that means that your Torah is really only able to be miskayim b'ofen hegioni, in an intellectual way. If a guy says there's a Shulchan Aruch how to deal with women at work, then he's being mekayim the lilmod lamed shmalasas mekayim, the second half. Something beautiful about as Anyi Vesigia Kapai Royale Kimba, and that's what I would tell the guys who are going to work.
So you, I guess, naturally transition to the next topic, which we're going to talk about, which is careers and working. And I don't know if you recall exactly how that conversation actually went down with that lawyer, but I'm wondering, do you think it was successful? And to broaden the lens a little bit, I feel like many Bnei Torah understand that idea on some level, but it just doesn't feel real to them, or feel spiritually fulfilled, whatever that might mean. But they, a lot of the listeners to this podcast who I speak to, there's something missing there, even though on a certain intellectual level, we just had this conversation recently, they know that to be true, that there's a broader picture here that very much encompasses the work and all of the Hechsher Mitzvah involved in it. But Lamaisa, it just doesn't feel, something feels off.
I was in Eretz Yisrael like 30 years ago, long time ago, and I took my kids on a tour of the north. So we rented a car, and we were in the north, and the car broke down, and it was stopped. So I had to take it to Kiryat Shmona, was the closest town, and they told me that there's a fantastic mechanic in Kiryat Shmona. I should go only to him. And he was an old, maybe a Yemenite, Sephardi. And he said, I said, my kids are here. Could you try? And he said, I'll push you to the front of the line. And I talked to the guy. I said, they say you're the best mechanic in Kiryat Shmona. I said, where'd you go to school? He said, I didn't go to school. I learned. He said, so what makes you the best? So he says, Baruch Hashem, he said, God gave me the skill of a mechanic. And he gave me how to earn a living. He says, and every time I put in a screw in a carburetor, I say to myself, I'm putting in this screw because Rabbeinu Shalom gave me this screw to put in, and this to earn my parnasa, and this to help this person. And he says, L'shem yichud kodsha, and I put in this screw. And I looked at this person, I said, wow, he really learned how to take Torah and bring it into his life, right? In a very unreal type of a way, the holy mechanic from Kiryat Shmona. And I think a lot of us have what to learn from him.
And beyond the sort of broad emuna and other things that you just discussed, are there other important components that when we define success in our careers as Bnei Torah, we should be thinking about?
I think that a lot of Bnei Torah, or maybe most Bnei Torah, believe that their life is a mission, and if they were sent to work, it's part of the mission that Rabbeinu Shalom sent them on. Rabbeinu Shalom could have given them Rosh Hashiva's daughter to marry, or they could have ended up, being rich and being able to open their own, but he didn't, right? And it's just an acceptance that this is part of my mission, and this is part of my shleimus, and this is who I'm supposed to be. And I think that what stops us from doing that is when we start reading pictures in like magazines like Bechadrei Chadarim, whatever they're called, they put the pictures of rabbis dancing and this and that and all the silly things, And if we say that that's not necessarily the guy from Kiryat Shmona could be the holiest Jew. There's a Mesilas Yesharim. I think it's at maybe towards the end of the Sefer, Shara Kedusha. He says the most astonishing thing. He says that Kedusha, I think it's Kedusha, could be Shara Chasidus or Shara Kedusha. He says holiness is not what people think. And he says that you could be holy and be somebody who is terasayim nasai. But he says, but you could have the most degrading job, the most degrading blue collar job, and be Kodesh Kadashim too. He says, if you do your job the way it's meant to be with the right kavanah, he says you could be the holiest person in the world. So we're brought up that everybody wants to be the Ger Rebbe, the Skver Rebbe, the Lakewood Rosh Hashiva. This is theatrics. Missile Shisharm didn't write this.
That's very powerful. One other thing that I'm thinking about, you recently had an episode of Headlines, a fantastic episode about the mitzvah of Kiddush Hashem. And there also you contrasted the education in yeshiva, I think it was with Naftali Horowitz, that is sort of assuming you're never going to leave, versus the other education where Kiddush Hashem should really be emphasized as the core, one of the core values. I wonder if you could share a little bit more about that.
Well, we have an opportunity in the world to be Mekadosh Shem Shemayim. And there's Kiddush Hashem by a Yid, Yisrael, but there's also Kiddush Hashem by the Goyim. The Gemara is full of different Kiddush Hashem, the concept of Kiddush Hashem. The concept of the Gemara says, Toyes Hakum is Muta, but if you return it, you could be Mekadosh Shem Shemayim. So we have the ability to be Mekadosh Shem Shemayim every day at work. And what does that mean? By treating people with respect, by holding the door open for everybody. I mean, it's by treating women with respect. Many women are used to being looked at in a not sneistic way, right? A person has the ability to be Mekadosh Shem Shemayim, right? To, not to really look at women, which I can think is odd because people are always looking them up and down, right? So we have the ability to Mekadosh Shem Shemayim, or Chas v'Shalom to be Mechal Shem Shemayim. And that's something real. I mean, Kol ma shebarasi l'chvaydi barasi. The Gemara says it's the biggest thing, Kiddush Hashem. So these are things that in yeshiva we're not taught about at all. I mean, you're in a very insular society. You do what you're supposed to be done. I think that what you're saying is another element of what you could create at work that you don't have outside of work. We recently, the company I'm with was voted in New York City one of the top 42 places to work in New York City out of hundreds of thousands. And we were voted one of the top 50 in the United States to work. The only reason I mention is, what does it come from? It comes from treating people with respect. Nobody ever leaves. Occasionally people are asked to leave, but very rarely do people leave. My father, Zechariah Levracha, told me that he once was by Rav Abramsky, and he said, Rav Abramsky told him, it says, Nikra Chassid, Omrim Alav Hai Chassid, Hai Anav. He picked a spot in Shul, so he's Hai Chassid, Hai Anav. So Rav Abramsky said, this is what happens. A guy picks a place in Shul. A year later, somebody else comes next to him, and the guy is coughing and chewing or talking. So I can't daven here anymore. You move to another place. Come to the other place, the guy behind you get into an argument with him because he davens too loud. So you move to a third place. He says, if somebody's able to pick a place and stay in the place, it must be Hai Chassid, Hai Anav. And I think the same thing has to do with employees, that if you could look at your place and you're saying you just rip through employees, you're not being Mekadosh Shem Shemayim. If you could say people come here and they're happy to stay here and they really don't want to leave here, you're being Mekadosh Shem Shemayim. And I think these are opportunities that you'll never have if you're in yeshiva. You'll have much less of them in yeshiva.
Wow. The final thing within the topic of work that I wanted to talk about is that you were recently on the Kosher Money podcast, and you were asked about why you are still working, despite the fact that financially it's not necessarily something that you need to be doing. A number of people were intrigued by those comments. I'm wondering if you can go a little bit deeper into what your hashkafa is around work and how that affects that decision.
I think that a person has to look at himself and say, where am I being mamale my potential, right, to the most? Right? There's a story with the Beis Halevi where the Gevir and Brisk, some Balmusa came in and and he said, you know what? The guy's right. I'm going to learn. So he closed his business and he supported a decent amount of the town. And they found him in the base medrash shuckling over Eilam Matzias. You could imagine now suddenly people didn't have what to eat, and it had a big effect. The Beis Halevi came and he said, no, your tzidkis is not to go work. Your tzidkis is not to go learn. Your tzidkis is to go work. We need you to work. And I think that we are the army of Hashem, Klal Yisrael, and there's so many different parts of the army. And I think a person could say, if a guy's a really good lawyer and in learning, he's, we need you. We need somebody to, as a lawyer, I know that he's suing all these different organizations that are anti-Israel or anti-Yiddishkeit. He couldn't learn anywhere in the world and have the impact that he's learning. So a person has to look at himself and say, where could I have the best impact in the army of Hashem? And it's sort of like the Mesilas Yesharim I quoted. And if it's someplace else and you change, it's bad use of your time and energies. Not your highest and best use. I think a person has to look at themselves and say, where am I at the highest and best use in the army of Hashem?
Can you spell a little more about how you view that role within your current place in the world and in the business world?
Yeah, so for me, right? I mean, I could go back to yeshiva, right? I mean, I support a lot of people, right? I mean, I do a lot of good works, right? And I still manage to learn. I mean, I print every 2 or 3 years another sefer a book, right? I just did Mishnah Chayna Chelik Beis came out, was 5 years of work that there's an expression, if you want to get something done, give it to a busy person. And so I'm able to do that. And for me to go back to learn, I just don't see that I would be using my skill set in the highest and best way.
So when we talk about your sort of career in the business world and your Torah background, so to put those two things together, those things sort of connect in one of your recent projects, which I found very intriguing. Different, the some of the social media work that you're doing lately to spread Torah beyond just sort of the confines of our Dalet Amos community. So can you tell us a little bit more about what drove you to do that?
Yeah, so headlines is Baruch Hashem very successful. We get like 100,000, 125,000 people a month downloading it. Could be more, but we set them out. But at some point, you want to touch the Achenu Bnei Yisrael that are Begoila, that don't know who Avraham Avinu is and barely don't know if there is a Bari Elam. And they may have had a great grandfather who was from, but we're really at the edge of that. And I said, where can I meet these people and try to sell them some Torah, right? And you have to meet them where they are, and where are they? They're in social media. I mean, you can't create it. So I created a thing called We Are Off the Page, and it's extremely challenging. Let me tell you, it's one of the most challenging projects I've ever done for many reasons. One reason is, how do you teach Torah to somebody who doesn't believe in God, right? And how do you teach Yom Tovim to people who don't believe in the Torah, don't believe in Yom Tovim? So it's like they don't necessarily disbelieve, but they're this. Like that's problem A. Problem B is, how do you get their attention? Right? And it's really hard. And I said, you know what? Hard never scared me. Right? Going to work was very hard. I'm going to do it. And I started it around 6 months ago, and um, we're getting around 300,000, 350,000 views a week. Right? And I don't know how many of them are Jewish, but certainly a decent number. And I just recently, yesterday, I saw one of the comments as, wow, I'm learning all about Judaism from this fellow, which was exactly. And the truth is, I don't know how many somebody I said, is it worth the time? And he said, one thing you can know, the people who you're reaching here with Torah will never, ever hear another piece of Torah in their life. And it's about continually finding ways to reach them. So I'll give you an example. I figured most Jews know about dipple an apple and a honey on Rosh Hashanah. It's like one of those things they heard of the shofar, they heard the apple and the honey. He said, what is the apple and the honey? All right, so you have to So I said a few different things, but one, for example, is the honey. They say when Howard Carter, he was the great explorer, found King Tut's burial chamber in the Valley of the Kings in Luxor in Egypt, right? So it was like one of the biggest discoveries and maybe the biggest in archaeological history. And imagine opening up a door that nobody had been in thousands of years, maybe 4,000 years. And there was all kinds of gold items there and masks. The casket itself of King Tut weighed almost a ton of pure gold. So one of the things he found was a pot, and he opened up the pot, and in the pot was honey. And the honey was as fresh as it had been put in there 3,500 years ago. And scientists subsequently discovered that honey never decays, never ruins. It's the only food in the universe that doesn't get ruined. I mean, salt doesn't, but it's not really a food, right? And I said, the apple is sweet, and we all want to have good sweet things. We want to have, but Klal Yisrael, we really want sweeter things. We want sweet things that never ever decay, that last forever. The sweetness of love, the sweetness of children, the sweetness of friendship, the sweetness of relationship. So this is something that a Freya person could say, hey, I get it, well, dipping the apple in the honey. And it's continually finding thoughts like this that you don't have to believe in God, and that's how you start. And maybe after they've heard hundreds of them, they start to say, hey, I learned about Shabbos, and then they do, but you have to start, butz and mekatni yadiyah, right? Kol shafa v'shafa milseh. You start very small, and you hope that that it grows over time. And I think that as Eden, we have a sort of an obligation. Rambam writes in Sefer in mitzvah in Sefer Mitzvahs and Asay 5, I think it is mitzvah Hey. He says how it's a mitzvah on the Jews to see that the Rebbeinu Shalom is beloved on the behalf of by all of the Jewish people, and maybe even by all of humankind, but certainly by all of Jewish people. And these are the people who are disappearing. So to me, it's like I could say another shtickle Torah to the 74th Kollel in Ramot, or you could say, let's try to be the only guy who will say Torah, and they will never ever hear Torah again. And I don't know if I'm going to be successful or not, but I'm certainly going to keep trying.
It's interesting how it goes back to what you were saying before, how the sugyas that you discovered in headline were sugyas that were untouched and you had like no competition. And so to here, this base medrash that you're building is also, you've discovered that you can act in a field where there's no one competing with you, no one else is trying to deal with it. So that's very, very interesting as well. With regard to the technology that we're recording on right now and we're used on a day-to-day basis, in the Torah world, in the secular world, there are debates whether it's making us lazy and stupid and distracted and all these things versus others who say technologies are always changing, people are always changing. And then in addition to that, there's the argument, well, like my nafkamina, we could debate whether it's making us stupid, but anyway, we need to engage with it. Anyway, anyone who's a balabas is going to have a smartphone, is going to have to be engaged online in different things. So how do you suggest that we as Bnei Torah approach these different topics? Because the technology is always there. It can pose very serious challenges, but in a certain sense, we have to do it.
So I think this is an ancient debate. Right, when the printing press came out, so the Marsha in Chidushei Halachos writes it's a terrible thing, right? The Marshal writes, Rabim me'amei haaretz misyarim. It's going to cause amei haratzim to become boastful that if he has money, he's going to print a sefer and he's going to walk around carrying his sefer. The Ramah writes negatively about it. I mean, many, many, many. It was a debate. But where would we be without Sfarim today? I mean, there would be no Klal Yisrael without Sfarim. There would be no Torah, basically, if it was all by a ball pair, right? So ultimately, we saw that technology won. And it's not the first time, when you look, you had after the Gemara was over by Ravina Ravashi in the 700s, 600s, right? There was sort of like a blank period for a few hundred years, the Rabbanan Savrai. Then the Gaonim came out and it flourished. And what happened then? Papyrus, a plant type of it was very expensive, but it was like writing on a shell of a plant, right? But that allowed the Gaonim to spread their Torah and to write Torah. And what happened after the papyrus? When did Torah really explode by the Rishonim? What happened was I think it was the Egyptians went to war with the Chinese, and when they defeated certain of the Chinese armies, they captured paper makers from China, and they learned paper, and it reached Europe around the year 1000 or 1100. And that's when the explosion came of the Rishonim. You could write down Pirush HaKuntras. Well, guess what? The Kuntras was written on paper that was taken from the Egyptians, from the Chinese, that we started using this technology. And that's why we were able to write Pirush HaKuntras, right? So I think that historically, technology this debate has been around, and those who have been against it have lost. Now, could you say it's different this time? It could be, but when you look at the reality of it, is like it's like oxygen. I mean, could you use the internet or not use the internet? There's nothing that doesn't use the internet anymore in a modern world. And they came out from the Paiskim and here and there, a cherem and AI. I said it's like putting a cherem on electricity. Like, what doesn't use AI today? And it's honestly, that's not, answering oxygen is not going to work. putting controls on oxygen is very important. Discussing about boundaries on it, I think, is very, very, very important, right? But saying that, we're going to put our head down and say we're not going to use AI. Well, you can't. There's nothing you can do online that isn't using AI. And if you don't want to use AI, there are no more travel agents. Maybe there are. I don't know. But that. Do you really want to still go shopping? I mean, I, I don't know if my wife has been in a store in years because all the Shabbos is all done. So I think it's like answering oxygen, and it's going to be much more relevant to put boundaries on it. But the debate is an ancient debate. It's not a new debate.
You mentioned how busy you are, how many things you're involved in. Do you have any time management, either shitos or tips or just other things you want to share? How you manage time to practically take all the things we've been discussing and somehow make them work?
I think that for starters, every day I wake up and I say, okay, what is the most important thing I have to do today? So it could be the most important thing at work or the most important thing at learning, but there's so much noise. And it's a question of where do you want to focus your attention? What is the best use of your time? And you have the same concept in halacha, by the way. For example, it says, Mevatlan Talmud Torah Lakriyas Hamagillah. And the question is, Mevatlan Talmud Torah Lakriyas Hamagillah, Kriyas Hamagillah is a mitzvah of Talmud Torah. And the answer is that it's at the best, it's a very Bekias type of learning. So if you could be learning now, really be'iyun and solving problems and saying Chidushei Torah, and now you go to Kriyas HaMegillah, that's called Bittul Torah. That means you're not. So I think in our law, so you see the concept in halacha, really halacha l'maisa, that prioritizing what is the most important, right, is critical. So I think for starters, it's about prioritizing, and really, and certainly if you employ people, like what could other people do that I don't have to do? But I think in fact in my phone every morning it flashes, what is the most important thing for you to be doing today? That's starters. And I think another thing is that wasting time is a critical thing. And you see people that really they're just addicted to their phones. It's a type of an addiction, like alcohol or you name it, right? It's a phone addiction. But we as Jews particularly can understand. You could put your phone away for 25 hours on Shabbos, right? So there is a day in the week that the phone does not own you. So why can't you make that 2 days or 3 days or 4 days where I'm only going to check my emails 3 times today? So I think it's about prioritizing, and I think it's about setting boundaries. Both things that we're very good at, right? In halacha, we know there's prioritizing. I showed you by Mikra Megillah, but concept of Kiddush Hashem, or the concept of Gimel Averis Chamuris. So we do have and the concept of Shvisa, when there are things that they're off boundaries. We have a concept of Nida. We have Kol Yisrael's kashrus is surrounded by boundaries. Like, can we use some of those boundaries in our life for the new types of invasive things, such as media, social media, phone use, etc. I think those are good place to start.
Right. Okay. So let's go to our lightning round. 3 short questions, 3 hopefully short answers. We still have some nice long Shabbos afternoons. So what do you like to do at that time?
So to me, Shabbos is about the highlight of Shabbos is about two things. It's about reconnecting to self, right? And reconnecting to family, the things that in the Yagain Vanacha of the week, the Yagain and the rushing of the week. So I think Shabbos afternoon, which Chazal call Rava de Ravain, right? So you start Friday night, it's again, you're running to daven, you're this. Shabbos afternoon is the Yom Shekul. It's what are the most important things to me? It's either going to be learning or family. So those are where I really need to reconnect all the time. To your children, to your spouse. It's the tefillah of Shabbos afternoon is Ato Echad. Echad is where all the parts come together, where you really reconnect. So to me, Shabbos afternoon is about reconnecting to family and to the Rebbeinu Shalom.
Amazing. And as we enter the Yom Noraim, Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, what's your favorite sefer to return to this time of year?
I'm sorry, I'm a Kotzke in that respect. In Kotzke was Mevatel, it's Kia Shaifer in Elul. He said either you do Adam Matut Tshuva Gansia or Adam Matut Nishkin Tshuva. So to me, my favorite sefer is Gemara Rashi Taisvis or Shulchan Aruch, Shach and Taz, and it doesn't change in El. It's the same thing.
And that's like the Marsha at the very end of Megillah says that we don't do Shalom Midarshim B'Shana Yom Kippur because essentially tshuva should be done all year round. So we don't want to emphasize it too much around this time of year, which I appreciate a lot. And finally, if you were forced to choose some new job, something that you've never done before, maybe something you dreamed of doing as a kid, what would that be?
Clearly, technology. I mean, it's where all the chiddush of the world is going. And what is Klal Yisrael? Klal Yisrael represents the chiddush of the world. I mean, when they discovered the antidote to COVID, according to everybody except for Robert F. Kennedy, it was done by two companies, right? One was headed by a Jew from Salonika, whose parents were killed in the Holocaust or grandparents, and the other one was by a Jew from Israel. So the chiddush of the world, right? Be it Facebook or Google or now Larry Ellison, Oracle. It belongs to the. So if you're learning, you should be saying Chidushei Torah. And if I could, I had no education whatsoever, so I couldn't. But if I had to redo it, would clearly be where the Chiddush of the world is today.
Okay, Rav Dovid Lichtenstein, thank you so much for joining us, and wishing you and your family a Shana Tova Metuka.
Good gebencht, Take care. Bye bye.